In the autumn of 1941, an unlikely chain of events began to unfold, one that reads less like a military procurement story and more like a historical accident shaped by desperation, improvisation, and raw necessity. A company better known for hunting rifles, factories that had never produced weapons of war, and a man whose firearms education began behind prison walls were about to equip millions of American servicemen with a rifle that, by all logic, should never have existed. The U.S. Army needed a solution fast, faster than bureaucracy, faster than tradition, faster than engineering timelines normally allow. What emerged from this chaos was the M1 Carbine, a weapon born not from perfection, but from urgency, compromise, and brilliance under pressure. The idea itself bordered on absurd. The Army wanted a firearm that weighed far less than the standard issue M1 Garand, cost significantly less to manufacture, fired more rapidly than a bolt-action rifle, and remained effective well beyond pistol range. This request wasn't aimed at frontline infantrymen, but at the vast population of soldiers who kept the war machine running: radio operators, truck drivers, medics, engineers, officers, mortar crews, men who were increasingly finding themselves under fire despite not being trained or equipped as riflemen. Modern war had erased clear front lines. When Germany crushed France in a matter of weeks during the summer of 1940, American observers saw the warning signs clearly. Armored spearheads moved so quickly that rear-area troops were suddenly exposed, facing enemy patrols with nothing more than pistols that were laughably inadequate beyond a few dozen feet. The pistol, especially the venerable M1911, was reliable and powerful at close range, but it was never meant to counter enemy units appearing hundreds of yards away. The Thompson submachine gun offered firepower, but came with its own problems. It was heavy, bulky, and prohibitively expensive. The M1 Garand, though widely admired, was simply too much rifle for men already burdened with heavy equipment. Carrying radios, ammunition crates, medical kits, or mortar tubes for hours on end made the added weight and length of a full-size battle rifle more of a liability than an asset. Reports filtered up the chain of command describing soldiers fumbling with long rifles when ambushed, struggling to bring them into action quickly, or being slowed to exhaustion during long marches. By the late 1930s, the Army's leadership understood that something new was required. The Chief of Infantry formally requested a lightweight rifle, compact, semi-automatic, and capable of reaching out several hundred yards. It would fire a newly developed .30 caliber cartridge, one that balanced recoil, weight, and effectiveness. But while the requirement sounded simple on paper, the reality was far more daunting. Development dragged, approval stalled, and by the time the specification was officially accepted in 1940, the world was already burning. The United States might not yet be at war, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The Army didn't need a weapon next year. It needed one immediately. Winchester Repeating Arms, already overwhelmed with existing contracts, initially showed little interest. Their factories were busy producing Garands and commercial firearms, and they lacked the manpower to chase experimental projects. Yet opportunity has a way of revealing itself to those willing to take risks. Edwin Pugsley, a senior figure at Winchester, recognized that the company already possessed the seeds of a solution. Engineers had been experimenting with a lightweight sporting rifle design, and while it was never intended for military service, Pugsley wondered whether it could be adapted, scaled down, simplified, and re-engineered to meet the Army's impossible demands. Time was the enemy. There were no months for refinement, no luxury of multiple prototypes. Pugsley assembled a small team, pulling together engineers whose names would never become famous, but whose work would touch millions of lives. They worked relentlessly, fueled by exhaustion, caffeine, and the understanding that failure wasn't an option. Other manufacturers submitted designs, but many fell short during early testing. Some were too heavy. Others were unreliable. The Army scheduled another evaluation, and Winchester now had only a few months to produce something viable. Hovering on the edges of this story was David Marshall Williams, a man whose life defied simple categorization. Years earlier, Williams had been convicted of killing a law enforcement officer during a violent confrontation. While incarcerated, his mechanical aptitude caught the attention of prison officials, who allowed him to set up a workshop. There, Williams immersed himself in firearms design, filing patents and refining ideas that would later prove revolutionary. His most significant contribution was a compact short-stroke gas piston system, an elegant solution that delivered just enough energy to cycle a weapon's action while minimizing fouling and wear. After his release, Winchester hired him, recognizing his rare talent. Though temperamental and difficult to manage, Williams possessed a mind capable of solving problems others couldn't. As deadlines loomed, Williams' refined design wasn't ready. The Army couldn't wait. Pugsley's team made a bold decision: build a prototype immediately using whatever components were available. In a span of less than 2 weeks, they assembled a rifle from scavenged parts, a trigger group from an older Winchester model, a modified operating rod inspired by the Garand. Components that should have been precisely machined were instead hand-fitted, adjusted by eye and instinct. It was an inelegant creation, a patchwork of ideas held together by ingenuity and hope. Just before submission, disaster nearly struck. The rifle's gas system wasn't delivering enough energy. Cycling was sluggish. Malfunctions loomed. With hours to spare, an engineer took a drill and manually enlarged the gas port, a risky, irreversible move. The weapon was test-fired. It functioned. Not beautifully, not flawlessly, but sufficiently. The prototype was packed and shipped to the proving grounds. When Army evaluators laid eyes on Winchester's submission, it hardly inspired confidence. Compared to other polished entries, it looked unfinished, almost crude. But tests don't care about appearances. The rifle endured accuracy trials, endurance firing, environmental abuse. Again and again, it performed. It met weight requirements. It handled smoothly. The short-stroke gas system kept the action remarkably clean. Recoil was mild. Controllability excellent. Against expectations, the rifle didn't merely pass, it excelled. In October 1941, the Army officially adopted the design. Within weeks, the world changed. Pearl Harbor was attacked, and America was thrust fully into the conflict. Overnight, the need for the new carbine exploded. Winchester alone couldn't meet demand. The solution was radical: enlist American industry at large. Factories that once produced office machines, jukeboxes, steering components, and typewriters were handed blueprints and told to build rifles. It was an audacious gamble, and it worked. The genius of the carbine lay in its simplicity. It was engineered for mass production, with generous tolerances and interchangeable parts. Components from different manufacturers could be mixed freely, assembled into fully functional weapons. Costs plummeted. Output soared. Within a few years, millions were produced, more than any other American small arm in history. On the battlefield, opinions varied. Some soldiers doubted the weapon at first, dismissing it as underpowered or too light. But experiences changed minds. Paratroopers found it easier to carry during jumps. Tank crews appreciated its compactness inside cramped vehicles. Engineers, medics, and radio operators discovered that when the shooting started, the carbine gave them a fighting chance. It wasn't a replacement for a battle rifle, and it wasn't meant to be. It filled a gap no other weapon could. Criticisms were real. At longer ranges, The cartridge lost effectiveness. Heavy clothing and body mass sometimes absorbed hits that would have stopped an enemy with a larger round. Infantrymen who swapped their Garens for carbines occasionally regretted it. Yet in its intended role, as a defensive weapon for troops caught unexpectedly in combat, it proved invaluable. By war's end, over 6 million carbines existed. Factories shut down as suddenly as they had ramped up. Workers moved on. The rifles remained. Veterans remembered them differently, some fondly, some bitterly. Heroes like Audie Murphy demonstrated what the weapon could do in skilled hands, using it with deadly precision under unimaginable pressure. For average soldiers, the carbine's strengths and weaknesses were inseparable. The M1 Carbine stands as a symbol of wartime improvisation, a weapon born from urgency rather than doctrine, shaped by civilians as much as soldiers, and produced by an industrial system pushed to its limits. It was never perfect. It was never meant to be. Yet when history demanded the impossible, it answered, arming millions and reshaping how wars are fought. By the early 1950s, the United States Army had enough distance from the chaos of World War II to look back at the M1 Carbine with a colder, more analytical eye. Official assessments completed in 1951 painted a sobering picture. Data showed that the overwhelming majority of effective carbine engagements occurred at extremely close distances, typically well inside 50 yards. Beyond that range, the likelihood of hitting a target dropped sharply, not because soldiers lacked skill, but because the weapon itself was operating at the edge of its practical capability. Complaints that had once been dismissed as anecdotal now appeared in formal reports. The .30 carbine round, firing a comparatively light projectile, simply did not deliver the same terminal effect as full-power rifle cartridges. Where a single hit from a Garand often ended a fight, the carbine sometimes demanded repeated strikes to bring an enemy down, especially under adverse conditions. Those limitations became painfully obvious during the brutal winter fighting in Europe in late 1944. As American units battled their way through freezing forests and snow-choked villages during the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the environment magnified every weakness in equipment and ammunition. U.S. troops wore heavy winter gear layered over wool uniforms, while German soldiers were often wrapped in even thicker coats designed for Eastern Front conditions. In numerous encounters, carbine bullets struck, passed through fabric and padding, and failed to penetrate deeply enough to cause immediate incapacitation. Stories spread through units of enemies absorbing hits and continuing to advance, reinforcing doubts about the weapon's effectiveness in extreme cold and against heavily clothed opponents. Reactions among soldiers varied. Some demanded to exchange their carbines for full-length rifles at the first opportunity, accepting the extra weight in return for greater confidence in stopping power. Others chose a different approach, sticking with the lighter weapon but compensating by carrying additional magazines, relying on volume of fire rather than individual shot effectiveness. This adaptation reflected a practical understanding of the carbine's strengths and weaknesses rather than blind loyalty or outright rejection. In December 1944, even as the war raged on multiple fronts, the Ordnance Department moved to address these concerns. Approval was granted for an upgraded version of the weapon, designated the M2 carbine. Unlike its predecessor, the M2 incorporated a selector switch that allowed the user to fire either semi-automatically or fully automatically at a rate approaching 750 rounds per minute. Conversion kits were distributed so armorers could modify existing M1 carbines rather than waiting for entirely new production. On paper, the solution seemed elegant. Automatic fire would allow soldiers to place multiple rounds on target rapidly, increasing the likelihood of incapacitation at close range. In practice, the timing worked against it. The conflict in Europe was nearing its conclusion, and only limited numbers of M2 carbines reached frontline units before Germany's collapse. A handful saw action during the final push into the Reich, but the variant arrived too late to significantly alter battlefield outcomes in World War II. Yet this was not the end of the story, nor even the most surprising chapter. One of the strangest ironies of the war was how highly the M1 Carbine was regarded by America's enemies. German troops eagerly collected captured carbines whenever possible, valuing them far more than many of their own issued weapons. The German military formally cataloged the rifle under its own designation, recognizing it as a self-loading carbine of American origin. Period photographs tell a striking story. German paratroopers and Waffen-SS soldiers posing with M1 carbines slung alongside their standard-issue rifles, particularly during the fighting in Belgium in late 1944. Even members of the Volkssturm, Hitler's desperate last-ditch militia composed of elderly men and teenage boys, were sometimes armed with captured carbines during the defense of Germany in 1945, preferring them to outdated bolt-action rifles or shotguns. The reason for this admiration was straightforward. German units in retreat faced the same realities American support troops had confronted earlier in the war. Speed and mobility mattered more than doctrine. There was no time for lengthy training on complex or heavy weapons. The M1 Carbine offered a simple solution. It was light, compact, quick to handle, and intuitive to use. Load a magazine, disengage the safety, pull the trigger. No complicated manual of arms. No punishing recoil. No need for extensive marksmanship training. Its simplicity made it universally accessible, regardless of language or prior experience. In achieving this, the carbine quietly reshaped American military thinking. Before its introduction, support personnel were often lightly armed or not armed at all, expected to withdraw or seek protection if combat erupted nearby. The carbine erased that assumption. Suddenly, radio operators could defend their equipment and themselves. Truck drivers ambushed on narrow roads could return fire. Medics escorting wounded soldiers no longer had to rely entirely on others for protection. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant blurred, replaced by a new reality in which nearly every soldier carried a functional firearm. This shift carried far-reaching consequences. Supply convoys became harder targets. Rear area units could establish their own local security without siphoning riflemen from frontline formations. Enemy raiding parties that once expected easy victories found themselves facing organized resistance. Just as important was the psychological effect. Soldiers who might otherwise have felt vulnerable gained confidence knowing they were not defenseless. Morale improved. The Army's decision to issue a carbine rather than a pistol signaled trust, and that trust mattered. A soldier who believes he has a fighting chance behaves differently under pressure, regardless of the technical limitations of his weapon. Economics played an equally crucial role. By the end of World War II, the cost to produce an M1 carbine had dropped to just over $30 per unit. This extraordinary efficiency allowed the Army to arm millions of personnel for a fraction of what it would have cost to equip them with submachine guns. The money saved helped fund tanks, aircraft, artillery, and the logistical infrastructure that ultimately overwhelmed Axis powers. In that sense, the carbine was not merely a weapon but a component of America's broader industrial strategy. Victory through scale, standardization, and relentless production. When peace returned, planners assumed the carbine's relevance would fade. Once again, events proved them wrong. In 1950, war broke out on the Korean Peninsula, and carbines reappeared on the front lines. This time, it was the M2 variant that saw the most use. American and South Korean troops relied heavily on the weapon, but Korea exposed new challenges. Enemy soldiers, often dressed in thick quilted clothing, launched mass assaults in harsh winter conditions. Inexperienced troops sometimes relied too heavily on full automatic fire, emptying magazines in seconds and finding themselves defenseless at the worst possible moment. After-action reports noted widespread ammunition wastage, especially among poorly trained units. Veteran soldiers adapted. They learned to treat automatic fire as a last resort, reserved for emergencies or close-range encounters, while relying on semi-automatic shots for control and accuracy. The lesson was clear. The carbine rewarded discipline and punished excess. The weapon's service life extended even further. During the Vietnam War, carbines remained in circulation well into the late 1960s and early 1970s. Special Forces advisors favored them while working with indigenous units. Helicopter crews kept them close at hand for emergencies. South Vietnamese forces were issued large numbers of surplus carbines. Even as newer rifles entered service, the carbine's reliability and abundance ensured it remained part of the inventory. Officially, the M1 Carbine was phased out of U.S. service in the mid-1960s, but reality lagged behind paperwork. National Guard units held onto them for years. Foreign armies and police forces across the globe continued using American surplus carbines well into the 21st century. Photographs from Afghanistan in the 2010s even show insurgents carrying carbines that first entered service during World War II, a testament to the weapon's longevity. Today, the carbine occupies a unique place in history. Collectors prize original examples, especially those produced by early wartime manufacturers. Prices reflect that legacy, with rare variants commanding significant premiums. Modern reproductions remain popular, proof that the design still resonates decades later. In the end, the M1 Carbine embodies the contradictions of wartime innovation. It was never the most powerful weapon on the battlefield. It never matched the range or punch of a full-size rifle. Many frontline infantrymen disliked it, and for good reasons. Yet it succeeded brilliantly at what it was designed to do. It protected the men behind the lines who suddenly found themselves under fire. It armed tank crews, engineers, medics, and officers with something practical and dependable. It turned vulnerability into resilience. More than 6 million were built. They served in multiple wars, in dozens of countries, across more than 8 decades. Few weapons can claim such a record. Designed in less than 2 weeks, influenced by unlikely minds, and manufactured by companies that once built jukeboxes and office machines, the carbine defied expectations at every stage of its existence. One American officer who carried the weapon summed it up with blunt honesty. He never claimed to love it. He knew its flaws, but every time he slung it over his shoulder, he trusted it to function when it mattered most. And in war, that trust is everything. The M1 Carbine endured not because it was perfect, but because it worked, again and again, when soldiers needed it to. Sometimes the best tool is not the strongest or the most sophisticated. Sometimes it is simply the one that keeps working when the world falls apart.